this is a really pleasant car to drive.
Overall, it drives really nicely.
I really like this car. I like the way it drives. I even quite like the interior.
But most importantly, it looks great.
But having spent some time in it properly here in the UK, I am really impressed.
Go take a look. You won't be disappointed. Back in January 2023, Jeep unveiled this, the Avenger, and almost instantly people loved it. It started winning award after award after award. European Car of the Year, World Women's Car of the Year. In fact, in a short space of time, this went on to become one of the most decorated cars in all of Europe. It's an all-electric family car about the size of a Ford Puma or Nissan Juke. It comes with a 54 kilowatt-hour battery for a range of about 249 miles, recharges at 100 kilowatts DC and costs around 36 grand. It's also designed specifically for urban families, which might seem a bit strange given that that's not historically been Jeep's target audience.
Now, it'd be fair to say that in the past, the Jeep name, the Jeep badge, has never been particularly famed for on-road driving manners. I mean, sure, it's fine off-road, but when it comes to tarmac, well, the car's mud-plugging prowess and rock-crawling ability, I mean, there was compromises to be made. But now, all that has gone out the window. For now, at least, every Avenger is front-wheel drive, and taking parts from the Peugeot 2008, well, it's worked wonders for this car's handling. And let's be honest, very few people are going to buy a car like this to drive up mountains like we are or across rutted terrain. No, it's far more important that a car like this is comfortable and quiet.
So what is the Jeep Avenger like to drive? Is it Car of the Year good? Well, we'll find out in just a minute, but the first thing I'll say is that it's very refined. This is actually the most refined Jeep I've ever driven. And of course, that's mostly down to the fact that it's electric, but it's an incredibly easy and pleasant car to drive. There's a little bit of road noise from those big tires and a little bit of wind noise from the fact it's shaped a bit like a brick, but it's not as bad as you might think. And the controls are super light. The steering is light, the brake and pedal feel really nice and progressive. This is a really pleasant car to drive.
It isn't the quickest car, 154 horsepower. Might sound like a decent amount, but in this age of instant acceleration with your EVs, well, yeah, you don't get that necessarily in the Avenger, even in sport mode with the full whack of power and torque.
In terms of performance, the Avenger doesn't have an awful lot. So this car uses a single motor driving the front wheels. It makes 156 horsepower and 260 Newton meters, and that's good for 0 to 62 in 9.6 seconds. Which, okay, it's not the end of the world, but you will realize how slow it is when you're pulling out of junctions or pulling onto roundabouts, because when you think you've got enough room to do those maneuvers and you put your foot down, you suddenly realize it's a little bit more gutless than you might have thought. Interestingly, there are many different drive modes in this car. So there's eco, there's normal, and there's sports, plus a whole bunch of off-road modes. And the amount of power that you get varies depending on which mode you happen to be in. Eco mode only gives you 82 horsepower. Normal mode gives you 106 horsepower, and it's only in sport mode where you get the full 156. So you might want to leave the car in sport mode if you're the kind of person who's always running late, or you find yourself doing last-minute maneuvers that you want to survive.
They've done a really good job of it. I really like the way this thing steers. It's got a really light-footed sort of response to it. The steering's quite precise. It builds weight quite nicely. It's very light, I have to say. So you've got your drive modes as you'd expect. You've got the normal, eco and sport, the usual. Very light in eco and normal. And initially I thought that was perhaps a bit too light, but actually around town and that kind of thing, I really quite like it. Gives it a really wieldy feel, given that it does build weight enough when you're going around roundabouts and that kind of thing, that you feel confident.
Well, it's not the most engaging car to drive given the lack of power. When you push it, you'll discover it has plenty of grip, even in these wet conditions. The other useful thing is the car's ride height. It might be tiny and it might only have front wheel drive for now, but it's happy to be chucked off-road, up tall curbs, and into many places where a normal family car might struggle.
Speaking of comfort, this car is inherently quite stiff. You feel that when you go over speed bumps, but it's not uncomfortable, and that level of stiffness, it only adds to this car's composure. One thing I would actually say this thing is lacking is a bit of front end grip, and well, maybe that would improve by a second motor on the back axle. You might just get a little bit more grip, a little bit more traction, but overall it drives really nicely.
What's the ride quality like? It's actually pretty decent. I was a bit concerned about that to begin with because Jeep told me they've increased the damping force of this car. They've made it stiffer in order to improve the body control. Now normally when you do that, you end up with a really stiff, harsh ride, but the Avenger is not too bad. It feels great on flat surfaces, obviously, and on larger bumps, it's actually pretty good. The only places where it might come a little bit unstuck is when you're on an uneven B road, where different corners of the car are doing different things at different times, and in those situations it can feel a bit like a newborn giraffe struggling to stay level, but for the most part it feels good.
Now the roads that I'm on at the moment, they're definitely not the smoothest in the world, and that's what you get in the UK. You know, you never really know what's coming next. There's quite a few lumps and bumps on this, but actually the suspension is soaking them up quite nicely. Now, when you pick things up and get onto a nice stretch of A road like this, you're actually much more aware of a bit of road and wind noise creeping in. If you can hear that coming into the interior, bit of vibration coming through the floor. It's nothing I'd be too concerned about, and it definitely quietens down when you're driving around town though. So handling into a corner, well, it doesn't feel quite as squishy as its comfortable ride might suggest. You don't get any real body roll. You've got a nice direct steering. The brakes are nice and strong.
I really like this car. I like the way it drives. I even quite like the interior. I like this colourful finish in here. It's got some really cool ambient lighting that changes when you change your modes and all of that stuff. It feels funky, but also functional. I like you've got the aircon switches down here, proper switches. That's all straightforward.
Have a listen to this. You hear that? That is the sound of the indicator playing you a beat whenever you indicate to turn left or right. At first, when I heard it, I thought it might get quite annoying, but I quite like it. Kind of want to bust a freestyle rap every time I go for a drive. That's cool.
Listen to this. Can you hear that? It's the indicator. It's awful, absolutely dreadful.
Now, for all its ability on-road, I know we've said this is not a proper Jeep, but it's got plenty of drive modes. You've got Eco, Normal, Sport, you've got Mud, Sand and Snow, and there's a hill descent control mode, and it's got 200mm of ground clearance. And with those short front and rear overhangs, it makes no issue of kind of dipping down into stony car parks like we are here around Malaga in Spain. Do you know what? I think as small SUVs go, this one is much more adept at crossing muddy fields or rutted terrain than most. And don't worry, we've been assured that there's extra protection for the battery underneath as well.
As for efficiency, that's good too. In my hands, it was easy to manage between 3 and 5 miles per kilowatt hour at outside temperatures of around 19 degrees C. That's thanks to a heat pump that comes as standard, which takes in cool air from outside, compresses and heats it, and then uses it to warm the battery for better efficiency. Given the 54 kilowatt hour battery, expect an approximate worst case of 150 miles in cold conditions on the motorway and best case of around 340 miles in the city during warmer weather.
Where it's let down though is the regenerative braking. You can flick it into B mode, there's a button just down here, but it's not the most powerful system. It doesn't really give that true one pedal driving, which is a characteristic of electric cars that I really like. I think they could have done more than that. And even though the handling is tidy, this isn't by any means a fast car, particularly for an electric car. You've got 152 brake horsepower, but you only get that full figure if you're in sport mode or you're really hitting the throttle. Driving in normal mode, you only get 107 brake horsepower, and it drops to just 80 if you're in eco mode. But when you slow it down and get it into town, it's quite a different story. It does feel far more refined, very comfortable, and it's got an absolutely brilliantly small turning circle, which makes it really easy to manoeuvre around town and to put into tight parking spaces.
A couple of downsides for me. One is that the seats aren't electric. They might be an option, but yeah, you have to manually adjust those, and adjusting the height especially can be a bit of a faff. And it's even more of a faff if it's a family car for you and you're constantly changing between drivers. So setting up the perfect driving position for you, if you're taller than your other half, might become a little bit of a pain. Also, even though it has heated seats, there's no direct button to access those heated seats. You've actually got to go into the menu system, into climate, and then choose the driver or passenger heated seat option there. Again, not the end of the world, but these things could be made slightly easier. One thing I'm really loving is how square and small the car is. You can literally see where the edges of the Avenger are, front and rear, and that means it's very easy to maneuver around town, really easy to park, and you've also got reverse parking cameras and a drone view to help you get the car into a space. I'm not the world's biggest fan of these drive selector buttons down here on the center console for park, reverse, neutral, drive, and extra brake regeneration. I'd rather have a stick, but at least they work.
If you remove any preconceptions of what you think the Jeep brand should or shouldn't be, and we recommend on this evidence that you do exactly that, then the Jeep Avenger is a really capable small SUV. You're not buying one of these to carry 5 people and their luggage. You're not buying one of these if you're going to cover